Harlem, 1966. The air itself felt angry, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to explode. Across America, cities were burning. Watts, Newark, Detroit, the smoke drifting across state lines like a warning no one could ignore. The old promises of civil rights were cracking under pressure, polite marches giving way to raised fists, tired prayers replaced by raw demands for power. Televisions glowed with images of chaos, police lines, shattered glass, and young men who had decided that patience was just another word for surrender. In Harlem, history wasn't written in textbooks, it was written on brick walls, police reports, and the memories of people who had learned how to survive when the system refused to protect them. This was a place where dignity was currency, where respect kept you alive, and where weakness was an invitation. And in the middle of it all, while the world outside screamed and burned, there was a quiet apartment at Lenox Terrace where the past and future sat at the same table. At the head of that table sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, older now, heavier with years, his hair silvering at the temples, his movements slower, but his eyes still sharp enough to cut glass. This was a man who had survived gang wars, federal prisons, and enemies who no longer had names because no one remembered them anymore. The newspapers called him semi-retired, as if men like him ever truly stepped away. But Harlem knew better. A lion doesn't retire, he waits. Bumpy Johnson had lived his life by power, not permission, carving space for himself in a country that never intended to make room for him. He had ruled with fear when fear was the only language anyone respected, and he had paid for it with blood, time, and solitude. Now the world was changing again, and Bumpy was changing with it, trying in his own imperfect way to trade violence for legitimacy, reputation for redemption. Because sitting across from him each morning wasn't a soldier or a rival, it was a child, a granddaughter who represented everything he had never been allowed to have. In 1966 America, power wore white robes and sat on benches, while dignity was something black families had to defend with their lives. This story is not about riots or politics or headlines. It's about what happens when hatred crosses the wrong line and meets a man who never forgot how to hunt. Inside Lenox Terrace, the noise of Harlem faded into something distant and manageable, like thunder heard through thick glass, and Bumpy Johnson liked it that way. The apartment wasn't flashy. There were no neon signs or loud colors, just mahogany furniture worn smooth by time, Persian rugs that absorbed sound, and the steady, comforting smell of Mame Johnson's coffee drifting through the rooms. This place was a fortress, not against bullets or police raids, but against chaos, a space where the world's cruelty wasn't allowed to speak above a whisper. For a man who had spent most of his life navigating violence, prisons, and betrayal, silence had become the ultimate luxury. And at the center of that silence was the reason he still bothered waking up every morning. Margaret, 16 years old, soft-spoken, sharp-minded, and carrying herself with a quiet dignity that felt almost out of place in a city that demanded hardness to survive. She was his granddaughter by blood, the daughter of his Elise, but in every way that mattered, she was his and Mame's child, raised under their roof, protected by their love, and guarded by Bumpy's reputation like an invisible wall. To Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was a legend, a criminal, a problem that never fully went away. But inside those walls, he was just Granddaddy, the man who read newspapers at breakfast and asked about homework instead of headlines. Margaret was his redemption, walking around in a plaid school uniform, the proof that something clean could grow out of a life built in the dirt. Where Bumpy had learned algebra from backroom numbers and survival from prison yards, Margaret learned chemistry from textbooks and discipline from classrooms that promised futures instead of funerals. He had fought his way into power with straight razors and stubbornness, but for her, he paid tuition in cash wrapped in rubber bands, buying legitimacy 1 month at a time. A private Catholic school in Riverdale, one of the first to integrate, a place he believed education could do what violence never could, open doors instead of kicking them down. And every morning she left that apartment carrying his hopes in her book bag while he stayed behind wondering if hope was enough. Because there was another child, another future that haunted him quietly. David, his son, brilliant and gentle, who had been sent away to Switzerland years earlier, exiled not for misbehavior, but for safety. Bumpy had known even then that America wasn't ready for a black boy with promise and a dangerous last name, and sending David away had been the price of keeping him alive. It was a decision Bumpy never forgave himself for, a wound that never closed, only scarred over. Margaret was his second chance, the life he refused to surrender to fear, the child he would not send away. Inside Lenox Terrace, surrounded by quiet and coffee and morning routines, Bumpy allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this fortress was strong enough to hold the world back. That morning, the fortress at Lenox Terrace felt different, like a room where the air had shifted but no one had named it yet. And Bumpy Johnson noticed immediately because men who survive, as long as he had, don't miss changes in the atmosphere. Margaret sat at the breakfast table across from him, her oatmeal untouched, her shoulders drawn inward as if she were trying to make herself smaller, a habit learned by people who don't want to be seen. She kept her head down, eyes fixed on the bowl, lifting her spoon with an awkward stiffness that didn't belong to a healthy 16-year-old girl. Bumpy watched the way she favored her left side, the way her wrist bent slightly when she moved, the way her posture curved protectively around an invisible bruise. He had spent decades reading rooms, reading men, reading lies told with smiles and hands that shook just enough to betray the truth, and this was no different. This wasn't clumsiness. This wasn't teenage moodiness. This was concealment. When he asked her about it, his voice was soft, almost casual, but his eyes never left her face, not for a second. Margaret flinched before she answered, a small, involuntary reaction that landed in Bumpy's gut like a warning bell. She said she was fine, said she had tripped in gym class, volleyball, landed funny, said it quickly, too quickly, like someone reciting a line she had practiced on the bus. Bumpy didn't challenge her, because predators don't rush their prey, and protectors don't force confessions from the people they love. He glanced at Mame as she poured coffee, and in that brief exchange, nothing was said, but everything was understood. Mame's eyes were tight, her mouth set in a way Bumpy had only seen when trouble was already inside the house. They let Margaret finish breakfast, let her gather her bag, let her kiss Bumpy on the cheek like she always did, even though his instincts were screaming now, the same instincts that once warned him when men with guns were waiting around corners. When the door closed behind Margaret and her footsteps faded down the hall, the silence in the apartment grew heavy. Mame didn't need to be asked. She walked into Margaret's room and came back holding a blue cardigan, torn at the sleeve, crumpled like something that had been grabbed and twisted in anger. The fabric was smeared with permanent ink, dark and careless, the kind that never truly comes out. Bumpy stared at it without touching it, his jaw tightening slowly, the old fire waking up behind his eyes. Gym class, he repeated quietly, not as a question, but as a verdict. He knew the sound of a cover story when he heard one, and this lie, this small lie meant to protect everyone else, felt more dangerous than the truth. Bumpy Johnson stood at the window watching the rain trace slow paths down the glass, his mind already moving through possibilities with the patience of a man who had survived long enough to know that the first impulse is usually the wrong one. Anger was there, hot and immediate, pressing against his ribs like a caged animal, but he didn't let it out, because Bumpy had learned decades ago that rage makes noise, and noise attracts mistakes. In his world, the truth always revealed itself, not when you demanded it, but when you gave it room to breathe. People, especially frightened people, told their stories in pieces, and the job of someone who wanted the whole picture was to listen without flinching. Margaret had lied to protect herself, to protect him, maybe even to protect the fragile illusion that things would get better if she kept her head down, and Bumpy respected that instinct even as it tore at him. He knew that if he charged into that school in a fury, he wouldn't be a grandfather, he'd be a headline, an angry black man confirming every ugly story America liked to tell itself. Storming in blind might feel righteous, but it was sloppy, and sloppy got people hurt. Bumpy had never survived by being sloppy. He had buried men who acted first and thought later, men whose names were etched on headstones because they mistook speed for strength. What he needed wasn't noise, it was clarity. He needed to know who was touching his granddaughter, who was leading them, and who was standing behind them pretending not to see. Hunting without knowing the terrain was for amateurs, and Bumpy Johnson was no amateur. So he made a decision that went against every violent instinct in his body. He would wait, he would watch, he would gather names, faces, alliances, and pressure points, because power didn't come from swinging first, it came from swinging last. In Harlem, Bumpy had built an empire by understanding systems, by learning who pulled strings and who just danced at the end of them. And he wasn't about to forget that lesson now. Whatever was happening at St. Jude's Academy wasn't random cruelty. It was organized, protected, and confident enough to leave marks. That kind of confidence always came from somewhere. And until he knew exactly where it came from, Bumpy would do nothing at all. He straightened his jacket, picked up his hat, and let the quiet settle back into the apartment, because the most dangerous move in any confrontation is the one your enemy never sees coming. St. Jude's Academy sat in Riverdale like a monument to certainty, all red brick and white pillars, manicured lawns trimmed to perfection, a place designed to announce who belonged and who merely passed through on borrowed permission. It was an elite school built not just on money, but on inheritance, where last names carried more weight than grades, and lineage mattered more than character. Inside its walls, power flowed quietly from father to son, judge to legacy student, banker to honor roll, reinforcing a hierarchy so old it no longer needed to explain itself. Integration had arrived on paper, but not in spirit, and the few black students allowed inside learned quickly that acceptance was conditional and fragile. At the top of this social food chain sat a small group of boys who moved through the halls, untouched, confident, and unafraid, because consequence had never learned how to find them. Leading them was Rick Van Doren III, tall, handsome, in the careless way only privilege allows, a senior who wore entitlement as comfortably as his varsity jacket. Rick was everything the school celebrated: football captain, charming, loud when it suited him, silent when accountability came looking. His last name was carved into the building itself, his grandfather's donation etched into plaques and library walls, his family history woven directly into the institution's identity. And behind that name stood his father, a state Supreme Court judge, a man who wore authority like armor and had taught his son, intentionally or not, that rules were something other people lived under. Rick didn't bully alone. He didn't have to, because he had structure, backup, and protection, all disguised as tradition. He called it leadership. The school called it confidence. But in truth, it was dominance rehearsed from childhood. Under Rick's direction, cruelty didn't look like fists or shouting. It looked like organization. It looked like a club. The so-called Preservation Club was presented as harmless, a student organization meant to protect school heritage, values, and culture, but everyone understood what it really meant. Preservation of whiteness, preservation of comfort, preservation of a world where boys like Rick never had to share space, attention, or authority. It was racism dressed in blazers and polite language, coded enough to survive scrutiny, bold enough to terrorize quietly. Membership wasn't written down, but loyalty was understood, and silence was mandatory. Teachers looked away because Rick's father signed their funding requests. Administrators hesitated because his name opened doors at the school board, and other students followed because power, once established, always attracts worship. This was the ecosystem Margaret had been dropped into, a place where her intelligence made her visible and her skin made her vulnerable. And from inside this rotten hierarchy, Rick Van Doren learned the most dangerous lesson of all, that he was untouchable, protected by legacy, insulated by law, and free to do whatever he wanted without fear of consequence. Bumpy waited until the apartment was asleep, until the quiet felt deep enough to trust, and then he moved through the hallway with the careful steps of a man who had learned how to exist without being heard. Margaret's bedroom was tidy in the way disciplined children keep things, books stacked neatly, clothes folded with intention, the kind of order that comes from believing structure can protect you. Her school bag sat on a chair by the window, heavy with the future she was trying to build, and Bumpy opened it slowly, already knowing that whatever he found inside would change the shape of the night. The chemistry notebook was on top, or what was left of it, its pages swollen and warped as if they had been soaked deliberately, the binding crushed, the cover bent and scarred. It looked like someone had taken it into a bathroom, drowned it, and stomped on it for good measure, not out of anger, but out of enjoyment. Across the front, written in thick black permanent marker, were words Bumpy hadn't seen in years, words that carried history inside them like poison. Slurs, crude and violent, telling her to go back to Africa, telling her she didn't belong, telling her that no amount of intelligence or effort would ever make her equal in their eyes. This wasn't teasing, it wasn't cruelty born of immaturity, it was psychological warfare, designed to humiliate, isolate, and erase. Whoever did this didn't want Margaret to cry once. They wanted her to disappear slowly, to doubt herself quietly, to leave without making noise. Bumpy closed the notebook carefully, his hand tightening until the cardboard creaked under his grip, the room suddenly feeling too small for the thoughts forming in his head. He had seen this before, decades earlier, when hatred wore hoods instead of school uniforms, when intimidation came with ropes and torches instead of markers and lockers. Back then, the enemy had been obvious, loud, and proud of its violence. This was worse. This hid behind privilege, behind institutions, behind the assumption that no one would ever come looking for justice. Bumpy felt something inside him shift, something cold and immovable settling into place. A line had been crossed, not just against his granddaughter, but against the fragile future he had tried to carve out for her with money, discipline, and restraint. This wasn't a lesson meant to teach dominance, it was meant to teach fear. And fear, Bumpy knew, spreads unless it's confronted. He thought of David, sent away to Switzerland years earlier, exiled so that hate wouldn't find him first, and the old guilt rose up like bile. He had promised himself he would never make that choice again, never surrender another child to a country that demanded silence in exchange for safety. As he stood there in Margaret's room, holding the ruined remains of her work, Bumpy understood something with perfect clarity. This wasn't bullying. This was terrorism. And terrorism only ends one way. The next morning, Bumpy Johnson didn't ask questions, and he didn't raise his voice because decisions like this were never announced. They were executed quietly, beginning with what a man chose to wear. He walked past the colorful suits that had once made him famous, the sharp patterns and loud statements that belonged to a younger, more reckless era, and stopped instead at a single suit hanging alone, midnight blue, conservative, impeccably tailored. This wasn't a gangster's uniform, this was a judge's armor, a suit meant to communicate authority without explanation, finality without threat. He chose a dark silk tie, understated cufflinks, polished shoes, every detail deliberate, because appearance was the first language power spoke. When he finished dressing, the man in the mirror didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a verdict. Outside, the Cadillac waited, black and immaculate, its presence alone bending the street around it, and Bumpy slid into the back seat without a word. As the car pulled away from Harlem, the city shifted mile by mile, brick and noise giving way to trees and silence, sirens replaced by birds, tension replaced by entitlement. This was the invisible border America pretended didn't exist, where skin color determined how much forgiveness you were allowed to make mistakes with. Harlem faded behind them like a memory people wanted to forget, while Riverdale rose ahead like a promise that had never been meant for everyone. Bumpy watched it all through the window, the manicured lawns, the wide streets, the houses that didn't lock their doors because fear had been outsourced to other neighborhoods. When St. Jude's Academy finally came into view, it didn't look like a school. It looked like a stronghold. Red brick walls rose confidently behind iron gates, white pillars framing the entrance like sentinels, the kind of architecture designed to intimidate before a single word was spoken. This wasn't a place built for learning, it was built to endure, to protect its own, to remind outsiders that they were guests at best and intruders at worst. The Cadillac rolled to a stop at the front steps, blocking traffic without apology, and Bumpy stepped out into the open air as if he owned the ground beneath his feet. He adjusted his cuffs once, slowly, and told his driver to wait because whatever happened next didn't require witnesses or backup. As he climbed the steps toward the doors of St. Jude's, Bumpy wasn't walking into a school, he was walking into a courtroom, and judgment had already been decided. The moment Bumpy reached the doors of St. Jude's Academy, the atmosphere shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the way it does when authority senses a threat it doesn't know how to name yet. A uniformed security guard stepped out from his booth, a retired cop with stiff posture and a hand that drifted instinctively toward his baton. The second he saw a tall black man in an expensive suit approaching uninvited. The question wasn't spoken yet, but it was already written on the guard's face, sharp and familiar, asking what Bumpy thought he was doing here. Bumpy stopped a few feet away, not close enough to provoke, not far enough to retreat, and looked at the man calmly, without anger, without apology. Racism expected noise, excuses, submission, something it could push against, but Bumpy offered none of it. When the guard finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of assumption, clipped and territorial, demanding purpose, demanding permission. Bumpy answered simply, saying he was there to see the principal, his tone steady, confident, final. There was no badge flashed, no threat implied, just the quiet certainty of a man who had survived places far worse than this polished entrance. The guard hesitated, eyes flicking to the Cadillac idling at the curb, then back to Bumpy's face, recognizing something he couldn't quite articulate, the unmistakable gravity of someone who did not need approval. Authority, real authority, doesn't ask, it waits to be challenged. After a long second, the guard stepped aside, muttering directions, and the doors opened without another word. Inside, the hallways smelled of floor wax and old paper, a sterile cleanliness that echoed with footsteps and privilege. Students moved between classes in neat uniforms, laughter and conversation filling the space until Bumpy's presence cut through it like a blade. One by one, voices dropped, laughter died, conversations evaporated mid-sentence as heads turned and eyes followed him down the corridor. Silence rippled outward, not from fear exactly, but from confusion, from the sudden intrusion of something real into a world built on insulation. Bumpy walked with unhurried precision, shoulders relaxed, hands at his sides, not scanning for threats, not acknowledging stares. He didn't need to announce himself because power that announces itself is already insecure. Teachers froze in doorways, students pressed against lockers, and no one dared to ask him where he was going. In that moment, violence wasn't necessary, intimidation wasn't required, and no rule was broken. His presence alone disrupted the natural order of the place, exposing how fragile it truly was. This was power without shouting, dominance without fists, control earned not through force, but through the unspoken understanding that this man did not belong to their system and could not be managed by it. As Bumpy continued down the hall toward the administrative offices, the silence followed him like a shadow, and every person who watched him pass understood something instinctively. Whatever business had brought this man into their sanctuary, it was not going to end quietly for someone else. The administrative office felt smaller the moment Bumpy Johnson entered it, as if the walls themselves understood that whatever authority lived here was about to be tested and found wanting. Principal Henderson looked up from his desk with the startled expression of a man who had spent his career enforcing rules on children and had never once imagined someone like this would walk through his door uninvited. Papers lay neatly stacked, tea steamed gently in a porcelain cup, and a framed mission statement promised discipline, character, and moral leadership, words that sounded hollow, the second Bumpy closed the door behind him. Henderson sputtered something about appointments and procedure, but Bumpy ignored it, crossing the room and seating himself without invitation, placing his hat on his knee with deliberate calm. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted, subtle but irreversible, and Henderson felt it immediately, the way weaker men always do when they realize the title on the door can't protect them. This was a gatekeeper who had mistaken silence for control, who had believed that looking away was the same as maintaining order. Bumpy introduced himself plainly, his name landing in the room like a dropped weight, draining the color from Henderson's face as recognition set in. Even in Riverdale, even behind polished desks and closed doors, that name carried consequences. When Bumpy spoke about tuition paid, safety promised, and discipline violated, Henderson nodded too quickly, offering rehearsed reassurances that sounded more like prayers than answers. He tried to hide behind codes of conduct and policies, the language of bureaucracy designed to soften accountability, but Bumpy cut through it without raising his voice, making it clear that words were useless without action. Then came the ultimatum, delivered without drama, without threat, but with absolute certainty. There would be a conversation, a civilized one, conducted in this office, or there would be headlines, photographs, and public disgrace that would dismantle Henderson's career piece by piece. Bumpy explained it plainly, outlining exactly how the slurs, the injuries, and the silence would look splashed across newspapers that loved stories about hypocrisy in elite institutions. Henderson glanced at the phone on his desk, at the framed certificates on the wall, at the carefully constructed life that depended on problems staying invisible, and he understood immediately that he was trapped. When Bumpy named Rick Van Doren and the so-called Preservation Club, Henderson flinched because now the danger had a last name, one that toggled the room's balance in the opposite direction. He protested weakly, invoking parental consent, school board politics, and the influence of powerful families, but each excuse only revealed how little control he truly had. Bumpy leaned forward then, placing his scarred hands on the desk, not to threaten, but to anchor the moment, to make sure Henderson understood there would be no misunderstanding later. The choice was simple: summon the boys quietly and keep this contained, or lose everything publicly and permanently. Henderson made his decision the way all cowards do, quickly and under pressure. He barked instructions to his secretary, his voice cracking as he ordered Rick Van Doren and his companions pulled from class immediately. As the seconds stretched into minutes, the room filled with a suffocating tension, the kind that settles before something irreversible happens. Bumpy sat back, silent and unmoving, checking his watch, refusing tea, refusing conversation, allowing the weight of anticipation to do its work. Henderson paced, wiping sweat from his brow, knowing that whatever walked through that door next would determine whether he remained a principal or became a footnote. Outside, footsteps approached, voices murmured, and the handle on the office door turned slowly. The storm hadn't broken yet, but everyone in that room could feel it gathering, heavy and unavoidable, waiting for the moment it would finally be unleashed. The door opened, and 3 boys walked in, summoned out of class like they had never been summoned before, their footsteps confident at first, carrying the careless rhythm of privilege that had never been interrupted by consequence. They wore varsity jackets and pressed blazers, hair slicked back, jaws clean and unmarked, the kind of faces that had never been forced to calculate risk before opening their mouths. In the center was Rick Van Doren III, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing arrogance the way some men wear cologne, thick enough to announce itself before he spoke. He barely glanced at Bumpy when he entered, his eyes sliding past him dismissively, already assuming that whatever this was, it couldn't touch him. He addressed the principal instead, voice casual, bored, asking why he had been pulled out of class as if this were an inconvenience rather than a summons. Henderson stammered, gesturing weakly toward the couch, his authority evaporating the moment Rick smirked and leaned back, spreading himself comfortably, confident that the room still belonged to him. Rick finally looked at Bumpy then, really looked at him, and recognition sparked in his eyes, not fear, but amusement, the kind that comes from believing you are untouchable. He said Margaret's name lightly, shortened it, flattened it, letting it roll off his tongue with practiced disrespect, a reminder that he had already reduced her to something small in his mind. Bumpy stood up slowly, deliberately, every movement controlled, measured, because rage without discipline was useless and he had buried too many men who forgot that lesson. He didn't loom, didn't shout, didn't reach. He simply closed the distance until Rick had no choice but to look up at him, really look, and for the first time that morning, uncertainty crept into the boy's posture. Rick laughed nervously, made a joke about grandfathers fighting battles for girls who couldn't handle school, and when he whispered the insult about her speech, about her belonging somewhere else, the room went cold. The other boys snickered, seeking validation, unaware they had just stepped off a cliff they couldn't see. Bumpy smiled then, not warmly, not kindly, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching a trap, close exactly as designed. He spoke softly, explaining tradition, explaining respect, explaining rules that existed long before Rick's father ever put on a robe, and Rick tried to interrupt him, tried to assert dominance, tried to reclaim the room with posture and tone. That was when Bumpy moved. It happened faster than anyone could process, one hand gripping Rick's collar, lifting him out of his seat, and driving him into the wall with precision, not enough to break bones, not enough to leave marks, but enough to shatter the illusion that had protected him his entire life. The sound wasn't loud, just a dull impact, but it echoed like a gunshot in the silence that followed. Rick gasped, his breath leaving him in a rush, his face draining of color as reality finally arrived uninvited. Bumpy leaned in close, his voice dropping to a register meant for one person only, telling Rick that fathers, titles, and buildings didn't exist in this moment, that only rules did, and Rick had broken them. He described men far worse than Rick, men who had thought themselves powerful, men who had disappeared because they touched the wrong thing, and Rick understood then, with terrifying clarity, that this wasn't a performance. This was instruction. Bumpy tightened his grip just long enough for the lesson to settle, then released him, smoothing the boy's jacket with almost insulting gentleness as Rick slid down the wall, legs shaking, eyes wide, struggling to breathe. The other boys sat frozen, staring at the floor, learning in silence what Rick had learned in terror. Bumpy turned back to Henderson, his tone returning to polite, conversational, explaining expectations clearly, calmly, outlining how Margaret's year would proceed, peacefully and untouched, how her books would remain pristine, how these boys would become invisible whenever she entered a room. Rick nodded frantically when addressed, unable to speak, humiliation replacing arrogance completely. Bumpy picked up his hat, paused at the door, and delivered the final line softly, reminding Rick that if even one more tear appeared, he wouldn't come back to the school, he wouldn't call lawyers, he would come to Rick's house at night and teach him what real fear looked like. And just like that, it was over. By the time Margaret walked into the cafeteria that afternoon, she was already bracing herself out of habit, shoulders tight, tray held close, preparing for the usual whispers, the glances, the small humiliations that had become part of her daily routine. She kept her eyes down as she moved through the room, expecting laughter, a comment, something sharp thrown just loud enough to hurt, but quiet enough to deny. Instead, the room went silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence, but the stunned collective pause of people witnessing a shift they didn't yet understand. Margaret looked up slowly, confusion crossing her face as she realized no one was blocking her path. No one was pointing. No one was laughing. At the center table sat Rick Van Doren, pale and rigid, his posture stiff as if his body hadn't quite forgiven him for the morning. When he saw her approaching, his jaw tightened, his eyes flicked toward his friends, and then, in a moment that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier, he stood up. He didn't meet her eyes as he stepped aside, clearing the path, his voice barely audible as he muttered an apology that tasted like humiliation. The room held its breath as Margaret passed him untouched, unharmed, unaware of the invisible violence that had preceded this moment. She sat at her usual table, opened her book, and began to eat, still uncertain whether this piece was real or something that might vanish if she moved too quickly. For the first time in months, her hands didn't shake. For the first time, no one tried to make her disappear. Rick remained standing for a moment longer, frozen in place, before sitting down slowly, his confidence stripped away in full view of everyone who had once followed him. He didn't sneer, didn't laugh, didn't reclaim control, because whatever had happened behind closed doors had reached deeper than pride. It had reached fear. Fear is a powerful teacher, far more effective than rules, assemblies, or moral lectures, and Rick had learned his lesson thoroughly. But miles away back in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson already understood the deeper truth. This wasn't victory, it was containment. Hate hadn't been cured, it had been cornered. He knew that humiliation breeds resentment, that silenced cruelty looks for quieter ways to survive, that men who believe in entitlement never forget the moment it's taken from them. The boy had been broken, yes, but the system that made him had not. Bumpy sat alone, watching smoke curl toward the ceiling, knowing that what he had done inside that school would echo beyond its walls. He had protected Margaret's body and her peace for now, but the anger he had awakened would not disappear quietly. Somewhere, a father would hear about this. Somewhere, power would feel challenged, and men who had never been told no rarely accept it without retaliation. Bumpy exhaled slowly, already preparing himself, because he had won the moment, but the war, the real war, had only just announced itself. The retaliation didn't come with shouting or threats. It came quietly, the way real power always moves, slipping in through official channels and wearing a badge while it did it. As Bumpy's Cadillac rolled back toward Harlem, the rain thinning into a gray mist, flashing lights appeared in the rearview mirror, not screaming for attention, just flickering silently like a predator signaling its presence. Two state troopers pulled in behind them, not the local cops who knew better, but outsiders with stiff hats and tighter jaws, men who saw Harlem as enemy territory and black power as something to be corrected. They didn't rush, didn't escalate, they simply stopped the car and approached with the confidence of men who already knew the outcome. One tapped the window with his baton, hard enough to make a point, ordering the driver out like he was livestock, testing boundaries, testing obedience. Bumpy's voice drifted forward from the back seat, calm and heavy, reminding them of warrants, reminding them of rules, forcing the encounter into legality where it didn't belong. The trooper leaned in anyway, flashlight aimed straight at Bumpy's face in broad daylight, delivering the message they'd been sent to deliver, accusing him of harassing a minor, of disturbing the peace, of stepping somewhere he wasn't supposed to step. When Bumpy responded with restraint, with language sharper than any threat, the trooper smiled because restraint was exactly what this visit was meant to punish. They walked to the back of the Cadillac, raised a baton, and smashed the tail light in a single clean motion, the sound sharp and final, glass scattering across the street like punctuation. It wasn't vandalism, it was instruction. The citation followed, handwritten and smug, a broken taillight manufactured on command, proof that law enforcement didn't need truth when it had authority. Bumpy accepted the ticket without flinching, knowing better than to argue with men who had already decided what justice looked like. As the cruisers drove off laughing, he understood the message clearly. This wasn't about a car, this was about territory. Bureaucratic warfare had begun. Within days, it spread like infection through the machinery of the city, inspectors arriving unannounced, licenses questioned, violations discovered where none had existed before. The policy bank was suddenly unsanitary, the tenements suddenly unsafe, the books suddenly suspicious. Warrants were signed quickly, raids conducted violently, doors kicked in without warning, runners beaten not for information but for intimidation. This wasn't policing, it was pressure, a slow squeeze meant to drain money, morale, and options. And behind it all was a man in a robe, a judge who understood the system well enough to turn it into a weapon, a man who believed the law was his personal sword. By sending officers to vandalize Bumpy's car, by unleashing departments to bleed his operations dry, he was announcing something important. He wasn't just a father defending his son. He was dangerous. He was angry. And he was willing to burn down entire neighborhoods' worth of livelihoods to prove that no one, especially no black man from Harlem, was allowed to challenge his authority and walk away unpunished. The pressure came fast and it came everywhere, like the city itself had decided to tighten its grip all at once, squeezing Harlem until something broke. Health inspectors shut down Bumpy's policy operation for violations that hadn't existed the week before, condemning spotless kitchens with clipboards full of fiction and smiles that never reached their eyes. Fire marshals red-tagged buildings over hairline cracks and imaginary hazards, forcing emergency payments just to keep families from being thrown into the street overnight. Police raids followed, not the quiet, negotiated kind Bumpy was used to, but violent theatrical ones. Doors kicked in before sunrise. Men slammed against walls, cash seized under the pretense of paperwork that would never be returned. Phones rang constantly. Captains panicked. Numbers runners disappeared, and money bled out faster than it could be replaced. This wasn't about law enforcement. It was about suffocation, a slow financial strangulation designed to leave Bumpy desperate enough to retreat, apologize, or sacrifice something he loved to make the pain stop. Tiny sat across from him in the back of the barbershop, watching ledgers pile up, watching a lifetime of careful balance start to tilt. He suggested the unthinkable, quietly, gently, like men do when they know the answer but are afraid to say it out loud. Maybe Margaret should transfer. There were good schools closer, safer, places without judges' sons and hostile hallways. The room went silent. Bumpy slammed his hand on the desk, the sound sharp enough to end the conversation instantly. She stays. If I pull her out now, he said, his voice low and absolute, then they win. If she leaves, she learns that intelligence doesn't matter, that effort doesn't matter, that a white boy with the right last name can erase her future whenever he feels like it. She learns that fear is stronger than merit, and I will not teach her that lesson. Money could be replaced, businesses rebuilt, but the damage done to a child who learns she doesn't belong is permanent. Bumpy stood and looked out at the rain-soaked streets of Harlem, knowing that this was no longer about economics. It was about principle. You couldn't fight a judge with a gun, and you couldn't fight him with money because he had access to more of both. The law was his weapon, and it cut cleanly without ever getting dirty. So Bumpy made a choice that had kept him alive longer than most men in his line of work. He would change the battlefield. You don't fight power head-on, you expose it. You don't answer corruption with chaos. You answer it with truth sharp enough to bleed. Every man who preached virtue, Bumpy knew, had a vice, especially the ones who believed themselves untouchable. Judges, politicians, moral crusaders, they all hid something. and the tighter they held their public image, the darker the shadow behind it. He told Tiny to dig deeper, not into bank accounts or property records, but into habits, routines, secrets. Find where he goes when no one is watching. Find what he does when the robe comes off. Because men like that never break the law openly, they bend it privately. As Harlem struggled under the weight of raids and shutdowns, Bumpy prepared for a different kind of war, one fought with patience instead of bullets, leverage instead of threats. He had drawn his line in the sand and refused to move it, even as the ground shook beneath his feet. Margaret would stay where she was, finish what she started, and learn that dignity wasn't something you begged for, it was something you defended. And somewhere in the city, a judge who thought himself untouchable was already being watched, whether he knew it yet or not. The weapon arrived at 3 in the morning, not with sirens or gunfire, but with a soaked overcoat and a manila envelope slapped onto a desk like a confession that could no longer stay buried. Tiny stood there dripping rainwater onto the floor, eyes bright despite exhaustion, because men like him lived for moments like this, moments when the truth finally slipped and showed its teeth. Inside the envelope was the thing Bumpy had been waiting for, the proof that the judge wasn't clean, just careful, the confirmation that righteousness had a price and someone else had already paid it. The vice wasn't women or liquor or bribes. It was gambling, quiet, obsessive, and catastrophic, high-stakes games across state lines where names were replaced with aliases and debts piled up faster than conscience. Pages from a ledger told the story plainly, a pseudonym, steady losses, desperate chasing, numbers so large they could only belong to someone who believed consequences were for other people. $50,000 in 1966, a fortune, a hole so deep it swallowed arrogance whole. Bumpy didn't smile at first. He studied the page, because this wasn't triumph yet, it was leverage, and leverage only mattered if it was handled correctly. The Italians running the game didn't care who the judge was or what robes he wore. They cared about money, and they cared about certainty, and Bumpy Johnson had built his reputation on paying his debts without excuses. The meeting in New Jersey was quiet, tense, respectful, men acknowledging power in its purest form, cash exchanged for paper, loyalty replaced by ownership. $60,000 left Bumpy's hands that night, his entire emergency reserve handed over without hesitation, because this wasn't an expense, it was an investment. In return, he received a signed promissory note and something far more valuable, permission to collect however he saw fit. By the time Bumpy crossed back into New York, he wasn't fighting a judge anymore, he owned him. Sunday morning came dressed in linen and denial, the Riverdale Country Club glowing with privilege, silverware clinking, laughter floating above the soft rustle of moneyed comfort. The judge sat at his usual table by the window, lecturing his son about posture and appearances, still believing the world bent to his will because it always had. When the waiter approached, nervous, whispering about a gentleman asking to see him regarding his portfolio, the judge frowned, annoyed, already irritated by the word. Then Bumpy Johnson walked into the room. He wasn't dressed like a gangster. He wore tweed elbow patches, a professor's calm, and he moved through the dining room without acknowledging the gasps, the stares, the sudden silence that followed him like a held breath. The judge stood up too quickly, chair scraping, rage and fear colliding in his chest as he demanded security, demanded removal, demanded control. Bumpy sat down instead, uninvited, casual, recommending the fish, dismantling authority with politeness. When the paper slid across the table, everything changed. The judge's face drained of color as recognition hit, his signature staring back at him, stamped, undeniable, owned. Security was waved away with a trembling hand, and in that moment, the room became irrelevant, reduced to background noise for a private reckoning. The judge whispered accusations of blackmail, of illegality, clinging to language because power had already left him. Bumpy corrected him gently, explaining that this wasn't blackmail. It was business, that he was now the creditor, and the judge was simply a man who owed money he didn't have. The terms were laid out calmly, methodically, raids would stop, licenses restored, inspectors silenced, Margaret protected absolutely, because debt creates obedience faster than fear ever could. The final condition was the cruelest and the cleanest. A $1 a week, mailed personally, signed carefully, a reminder that power, once exposed, never truly returns. The judge nodded through humiliation, his son watching silently, learning a lesson no courtroom could teach. When Bumpy stood to leave, hat in hand, the victory wasn't loud or violent. It was surgical, complete. This wasn't revenge, it was correction. The law had tried to crush him, and instead it had been purchased. As Bumpy walked out into the sunlight, the moral balance shifted quietly back into place, not because justice was blind, but because for once the note was held by the right hands. Graduation day arrived, wrapped in sunlight and ceremony, the kind of day institutions like to celebrate as proof that everything worked the way it was supposed to. And Margaret Johnson walked into the auditorium taller than she had ever been, confidence settled into her posture like something earned rather than borrowed. She wore her cap and gown with quiet pride, her future no longer something she had to defend with silence, but something she carried openly, surrounded by family who had paid for that peace in ways she would never fully know. Bumpy sat in the front row beside Maim, dressed in his best suit, hands folded, face unreadable, watching the stage the way a general watches the end of a long campaign. When Margaret's name was called, applause filled the room, polite and proper, and she crossed the stage, glowing, shaking hands, accepting congratulations that came too late to matter, but still felt good to receive. At the end of the line stood the judge, thinner now, older somehow, his confidence eroded by months of obedience he never spoke about. His hands trembled slightly as he held the diploma, and when Margaret stepped in front of him, innocent and smiling, he hesitated for half a second that felt like an eternity. He looked out into the audience, and his eyes found Bumpy's, steady and unblinking, a reminder that power remembered its debts. The judge swallowed and handed over the diploma, his voice cracking as he offered congratulations that carried more relief than pride. Margaret thanked him warmly, unaware of the weight behind the exchange, and hurried off the stage into the arms of her family. Bumpy stood and hugged her tightly, feeling the years lift just a little, because this moment, this success, was something no one could take back. Back in Harlem, the framed dollar checks hung neatly on the wall of Bumpy's office, one for every week the judge remembered who owned the truth, reminders not of cruelty, but of consequence. Bumpy never cashed them because their value was never monetary. It was symbolic, proof that even the law could be bent when it forgot who it was meant to serve. Margaret thrived after that, her grades soaring, her voice finding confidence, her life expanding beyond fear, and Bumpy watched it all with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew he had finally protected something clean. He could not save everyone, he could not undo the past, and he could not escape the life he had chosen, but he had carved out one safe future in a hostile world, and that was enough. As the family left the school that day, sunlight spilling across the steps, Bumpy paused and looked back once, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Justice, he understood, was never blind. It was negotiated, enforced, and controlled by whoever held the leverage. In a country where power so often hid behind titles and buildings, real justice belonged to whoever held the note. And for once, that note had been held by him. If you stayed until the end of this story, remember it. Because history is full of men who thought they were untouchable until they touched the wrong thing. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more stories where power meets its reckoning, because the shadows always have something left to teach.